Welcome to The Future and You. This episode is for January 28, 2009. I am your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. Our guest today is Jerry Pournelle. Jerry Pournelle is probably best known as a science fiction writer. With Larry Niven, he has co-authored over a dozen novels, including The Mote in God's Eye, Lucifer's Hammer, Footfall, Inferno, and his and Larry's new sequel to Inferno, Escape from Hell. He has also co-authored novels with Stephen Barnes, Roland Green, and Michael Flynn, and he's written many novels by himself. However, novels have only been a portion of Jerry Pournelle's work. After serving in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, he acquired master's degrees in both experimental statistics and systems engineering, and doctorates in both psychology and political science. He co-wrote a military textbook called The Strategy of Technology, which was required reading at West Point and the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. He helped to write a portion of Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address concerning a missile defense system which the media at the time enjoyed making fun of and calling Star Wars, since they believed the technology needed to shoot down incoming missiles with our own missiles was impossible. He worked in the aerospace and defense industries. He worked in operations research at Boeing, the Aerospace Corporation, and North American Rockwell Space Division. He was founding president of the Pepperdine Research Institute. He was campaign manager for Congressman Barry Goldwater Jr., as well as for Sam Yorty. And he has been a columnist for Byte Magazine since 1982. When I interviewed Dr. Pournelle, I had plenty of questions and he had plenty to say. We talked for 2 hours. For your listening convenience, I'll divide his interview into at least 2 shows, and possibly 3. This episode contains 45 minutes of our conversation. Topics include personal anecdotes about Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Larry Niven, and other writers he has been friends with, how the downfall of the Soviet Union was an engineered event, planned decades in advance, which worked exactly as planned, and specifically what that plan was. Behind-the-scenes stories of his work orchestrating the political campaigns of Barry Goldwater Jr. and Sam Yorty, his involvement and friends in the Survivalist Movement, and his being editor of the magazine Survive, which was closely allied with the magazine Soldier of Fortune, political stories from the Cold War, Vietnam, and mutual assured destruction, the results of his chemotherapy, and that he is now cancer-free, and a few words about his and Larry Niven's new novel, Escape from Hell. By the way, Dr. Pournelle several times uses the word nomenclatura. I was not familiar with it, so I looked it up. Here are the first 2 sentences of its article in Wikipedia. Quote, "The nomenclatura were a small elite subset of the general population of the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries who held various key administrative positions in all spheres of those countries' activity. Government, industry, agriculture, education, etc. The nomenclatura were analogous to the ruling class which communist doctrine denounced in the capitalist West." Unquote. There's a reason why it sounds like the word nomenclature. The Russian term nomenclatura was derived from the Latin meaning a list of names. And now, on to our interview. Here is Dr. Jerry Pournelle. First of all, I'd like to thank you for writing, along with Larry Niven, the novel The Mote in God's Eye, which is a brilliant novel, already a classic, and one of the small handful of books that made me want to become a writer myself. I also enjoyed Footfall, especially the big ending. But what I'm getting at is, you've written a lot of science fiction over the years, but many people are less familiar with your nonfiction and your other achievements, which is actually where I'd like to start. For example, you co-wrote with, and I'm going to mispronounce his name probably, Stephen T. Pisoni, okay, the textbook The Strategy of Technology, which became required reading at U.S. military colleges, including West Point. Its basic concept is often credited with bringing down the Soviet Union. For those unfamiliar, can you perhaps summarize it a little bit?
Well, Strategy of Technology was written by 3 people, one of whose name does not appear in the book, because at the time we wrote it, he was a serving officer, colonel in the United States Air Force, the director of plans of Air Force Systems Command with General Schriever. it was written in 1968 to 70, and I was just getting out of the aerospace business and hadn't really established myself as a writer much, but I was the one who basically put all of their stuff together and added some of my own to it. But it's more Pisoni's work than anything else. Pisoni was a professor at Georgetown. Prior to that, he'd been an intelligence officer in the Pentagon. And prior to that, he had been the deputy foreign minister of Austria when he was only 22 years old under the Schuschnigg regime, when they were attempting to keep Hitler from taking over Austria. So Steve was a professor of political science at Georgetown, and then later senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. So Steve is one of the better known academics, even though he's been dead long enough that people don't read much of his books anymore. But he and William Kentner were the authors of The Protracted Conflict, which was essentially the statement of the containment policy that was pursued by everybody from Truman on as the Cold War strategy of the United States. And strategy of technology essentially said that the way to defeat a totalitarian regime is to make sure you're always one step ahead of them technologically so that they can't keep up. And they won't be able to, because in general tyrannical regimes like that, tyranny is the wrong word, but closed societies like that have to have a great deal of restriction on the internal communications within their elites. Arthur Koestler once said that the necessary condition for the destruction of communism would be the free exchange of ideas within the Soviet intellectual community. So the notion of strategy of technology is that if the United States did things right, we wouldn't have to build so many weapons as we needed to develop them and be ready to deploy them if needed. And that would bankrupt the Soviet Union trying to keep up with us. That, coupled with containment, meant that they couldn't make war feed war, because if you don't let them expand, they have no places to take over and enslave and loot, which they did with Germany, for instance. The major boost for the Soviet economy was looting the wreckage of the Third Reich at the end of World War II. Now, you think there wasn't a lot left of the Third Reich at the end of World War II, and that's just the point. Despite all their 5-year plans, the Soviet Union really didn't have much of a technological and industrial society at the end of World War II, and they got a major boost simply by looting Germany and even Hungary. By making it impossible for them to expand, you don't let war feed war, which means that they now have thrown upon their own devices. They have to expand their own industries. They have to do their own research and development. And that's essentially the premise of the book. The book's available on my website. And the third guy was Dr. Francis X. Kane, Colonel, U.S. Air Force retired. Kane and I have thought of revising the book now that the Cold War is over, but we've never done it. So while the principles are relevant to the modern world, the examples are all basically Cold War, and specifically dedicated to that the enemy is the Soviet Union, which was governed by the nomenclatura and which was particularly vulnerable to this kind of strategy.
Yeah, that was my next question. Does the strategy continue to have value for our current time and into the future? Are there any countries that you could name that this should be applied to?
Well, we could have and did for a while, but the problem is the United States at the moment doesn't know whether it's a republic or an empire. And until you decide, you can't decide what kind of army you need, because empires need occupation armies that are capable of going over and spending long term living among the population and shoring up puppet kings, or nowadays they'd be puppet republics, but you see what I mean. Empires have an entirely different kind of need from republic. Until World War II, the United States essentially regarded war as a very unnatural state. Now, in the real world, there are those who say that peace is a state whose existence we deduce from the fact that there have been intervals between wars, but that war is really the normal state of mankind. And if you go back anthropologically, back into prehistory, you'll discover that, I don't know, something like half the male population whose skeletons we ever find died by violence. I mean, even back in prehistoric times, it turns out people are pretty good at fighting and like to do it a lot. And in New Guinea and some of those primitive places, that's still the normal way of dying, is you get killed in a war when you're about age 45 or 50. It's not much of a war. You don't think of it as a war, 3 villages fighting it out, and there's maybe 100 armed men on each side, but it's war enough.
Yeah, for those who are dying, yeah, it's definitely a war.
Yeah. So, in any event, the United States regarded war as a very evil thing, and anybody who pushed us into it had to be evil and thus had to be defeated. And by defeated, we mean, unconditional surrender. You're bad. We didn't have the view that this kind of conflict was as the British Empire and the Russian Empire put it, the great game in Afghanistan and India, where it was just seen as a series of moves, of imperial chess moves. The United States never saw things that way. Until World War II, we had to sort of learn about protracted conflict, and in fact, that was the title of the book on Patton's view, like MacArthur's, is that you got an enemy, let's go kill him. And the famous line in the movie Patton, which is from real life, where Patton's talking about the Russians, said, "We're going to have to fight the Russians anyway. Why don't we do it? Well, they got a goddamn army over here to do it with." And that, of course, was not acceptable to the American political authorities, and you don't have to endorse the notion that communist intellectuals caused us not to fight the Russians or something. It's just the case that the United States, for good or evil, we decided the way to fight the Soviet Union was to keep them from expanding. Clearly, that couldn't have been too bad an idea because it worked. Mm-hmm. It took a lot longer. It took, how to put it, it took longer than almost anybody except the architects of the policy expected it to take. But when the collapse came, it came so quickly that it had actually been unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that it was pretty much inevitable?
It turns out now that you can see in hindsight that it was, and there are people who are saying it would have been inevitable even if the United States hadn't been involved. And the key argument in that one is, should we have been in Vietnam? If Kennedy had not put us in Vietnam in 1962 or thereabouts, 61, and Johnson kept us there, despite the enormous unpopularity of a war which was just a long war of attrition, you couldn't just invade North Vietnam and get it over with, because everybody was afraid the Chinese would come in and then you'd really be in a land war in Asia. But if that hadn't happened, if, let's say, South Vietnam had fallen in 1962, then what would have happened when Indonesia had their civil war in 1965? It was a very near thing that Indonesia did not go communist in 1965. Had the world communist movement had the resources that they were being absorbed in trying to take South Vietnam, had those been available to throw into the fight in Indonesia, would the outcome have been different? You don't know. There is no way of knowing, but it is not an unreasonable proposition to say that Indonesia would have fallen. It darn near did. I mean, it was an ace of a thing. It was very close. Indonesia is the 5th most populous country in the world and has some, I don't know, a fair part of the oil resources of that area. And with all those resources, what might communism have made of those? That's really the point. Could they have exploited the Indonesian conquest with its oil to have kept the nomenclatura in power in the Soviet Union for another 20 or 30 or 40 years beyond what it actually stayed? I don't know. I don't think anybody will ever know.
I didn't realize they had that much oil there.
Well, it's what? 25% of the something like it's some fairly major fraction of the world's oil comes out of Indonesia. It was one of the reasons why the Japanese started World War II. You know, Dutch, Royal Dutch Shell, Dutch East Indies, there's oil over there and a fair amount of it. The Japanese have always thought there was more in that area that just nobody was able to get out. We'll see. But the Sultan of Brunei did not become as wealthy as he has because of selling rubber and.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised to learn how much political work you've done. You worked as the campaign manager for Barry Goldwater as well as Sam Yorty. Both were controversial figures at the time.
Well, Barry Goldwater Jr. is the senator's son.
Okay.
I was a county Republican official in 1968-69, and the party decided they wanted young Goldwater to run for office, so I was delegated to go tell him
that he's drafted.
He found that a horrifying prospect. As he said, he was a 40-year-old unmarried stockbroker making, I don't know, $40,000 or $50,000 a year, which in 1968 was a lot of money, and living one block from Warner Brothers Studios. And in fact, in order to talk to him, I had to chase a fairly well-known unmarried young movie lady out of his bedroom so I could tell him what I was doing. And he said, "Don't do this to me, for God's sake." Most eligible bachelor in Los Angeles at the time, and he did not appreciate the notion of having his life turned into an open book. And I said, "I have a message from your father. You're running." So we ran his campaign, and he won. It was not an unsafe district. It was a fairly good. In those days, it was a decent Republican district. They kept gerrymandering it, and they kept moving him west until, from having represented Burbank and North Hollywood, he suddenly found himself representing the sea lions out by Point Conception. And at that point, it made it more and more difficult for him to stay in office, and he had married by then, and he didn't. So my reason of liking him is because he got on the Space Committee, and he did a lot for the space program, including keeping Project Nerva going for another couple of years when they decided to shut it down. And eventually it was shut down anyway. I think Nerva is a nuclear powered rocket. It only works in outer space. You wouldn't fly it off the Earth. But if you want to go to Mars or between planets, you need something very like Nerva. And if you want to know more about that, I have a book that was released last August, collection of stories called Exile and Glory, the last part of which is a novella which was at one time a laser book, God knows how long ago, called Exile to Glory, which a Nerva-type ship going from Earth to the asteroid belt is a major piece of the story. So I know something about Nerva, and I think we need to if we're going to go heavily between planets, we're going to need nuclear-powered rockets. There's no way around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember reading about Nerva. I was very interested in it, I guess about 15, 20, 30 years ago, something like that. It was...
Yeah, it would have been... It was gone by 1980. Mm-hmm. It was out of the budget. Carter killed it. But
for any listeners who are not familiar with Nerva, the basic premise is you have some nuclear fuel solid in an encasement, so to speak, that you shove, for example, hydrogen gas through it just to heat it up to extremely high temperatures and let it go out the back end. So there's no combustion. You just use the heat of the nuclear.
And the hydrogen acts as the moderator, so it's throttleable. The less you send through, the less thrust, and it's a very clean. We got a measured ISP, specific impulse, something over 800 in New Mexico in ground tests with NERVA, just in the time when we were working on it. And for comparison, I think hydrogen, oxygen, the best you can get is like 400 ISP, and it was over 800 just with hydrogen and the NERVA, the nuclear rocket.
Has there been any talk of revising a NERVA type propulsion?
Every now and then I hear about it, but it is only useful for traveling between planets. It is not anything you would ever use to do much, even in near Earth orbit, much less get from Earth to orbit with it. It won't lift itself off the ground. You won't get a full gravity of thrust out of it. But what you can get is, I don't know, in the order of 1/10 of a gravity, damn near forever. So to get to Mars, you can do that in a matter of months rather than years if you have something like NERVA as an example.
Back to the campaigns, though, I'm curious. I read one book a long time ago called The Advance Man about running campaigns. What is it you feel that people don't understand about running a political campaign? Because, of course, you saw the inside of them.
Well, things are kind of different now. Now it's more and more media. I played the ground game with Sam Yorty. We had, in 1969, Yorty was a Democrat. And by the way, I'll tell you an interesting story in a second about Yorty and Heinlein. But we had the first black candidate for mayor, at least certainly the first serious black candidate for mayor. It was Bradley, who eventually did become mayor of Los Angeles and was not a bad mayor. But the 69 campaign was excuse the expression, colored by that, even if everybody tried to keep it from being. You see what I mean? If everybody tried to keep down, because Bradley had been a city councilman and was had been a police officer and was fairly well known in the city. And my strategy was simple. The mayor wanted to go down and campaign in the 15th Councilmatic and places like that, which are largely black communities. And he kept saying, but he had appointed more black commissioners in the city and to high posts in City Hall than any mayor in history, and he was proud of that record. And I kept pointing out to him, Sam, it doesn't matter. You're not going to win votes there. What we want to do is keep people there from being excited. So you campaign out in the areas where we know people will vote for you, and we'll get that vote out and let Bradley try to get his vote out. And we're not going to run a big media campaign and do a lot of things to excite people, because what we want to do, I think, would be wonderful if you could have an election and half the city wouldn't even know we were having one. So essentially the campaign I ran a precinct-oriented campaign to get the vote out. I had Yorty come out and, for instance, throw out the first baseball at in the Little League out in the valley, where the voters were going to vote for Sam, and we all knew it. And I had him appear in places where he was popular and just don't go. People kept saying, well, you know what? Bradley's not going to come out. And you see what I mean? People are getting out their own vote. I don't think there's anything racist about it. We're just going to get out our vote, and we're not going to try to win arguments. And I told my precinct walkers, you go around and knock on doors, and if you say you're there for Sam Yorty, and if they welcome you, that's fine. You get them enthusiastic and make sure they're going to vote. And if they say, well, I don't like him, you say, gee, that's too bad, and maybe ask why, but don't argue. We're not trying to win arguments. We're trying to get people who want to vote for Sam to go vote. And it worked. We won. Time Magazine guy asked me after it was over, he discovered that I had predicted the vote to within like 0.5% of where it would go. And he said, how did I do it? And I said, I just added up the votes. I figured out what councilmatic districts that Bradley would take, and I figured that if we could keep the excitement down, more than half of his people wouldn't vote, and that turned out to be the case. They just didn't go to the polls.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get his vote out. He went out and got headlines, but didn't get his vote out. That's what won. 4 years later, I wasn't managing the campaign, and a media specialist guy ran it, and he ran a media campaign, and Yorty lost, as I knew he would in a straight media campaign he was going to.
Mm. Well, what was that about Sam Yorty and Heinlein, Robert Heinlein?
Oh, well, I was in my office, the campaign offices down on Wilshire, and somebody called from up front saying that a man named Robert Heinlein come to see you, and Robert had said he was going to come around. He was in town from Santa Cruz, where he was living at the time. So yeah, well, sure, send him back. I mean, I got up and went out to get him, of course, but Robert came in, sat down in my office, and looked around, and he said, well, number one, I had less trouble seeing the President of the United States than I did seeing you, which I'm sure was not true, but it was funny. And he said, number two, what you don't know is that Sam Yorty ended my career in politics in, I think, 1938.
Mm-hmm.
I said, how was that? And he said, he beat me for the Democratic nomination for state assemblyman. 1938, I ran as a Democrat against Yorty for the nomination, and Yorty won the nomination, and he went on to win the assembly seat, and which is true, and spent like 8-10 years in the assembly before he ran for mayor of Los Angeles and won.
Mm-hmm.
So representing the area around Lookout Mountain where Heinlein lived back in those days, and yeah, Robert, and in fact, Sam still lived there up on Long Ridge Road, out of Studio City, but that district is part of the Laurel Canyon district where Heinlein lived when he was living up there, not too far from Hank Kuttner and Catherine Moore.
Mm-hmm. Well, does that mean that we have Sam Yorty to thank for some of Heinlein's novels?
But I asked him that, and he said, yeah, well, he had to make a living somehow. He wasn't going to make a living in politics. So, yeah, maybe. Because if he'd been elected to the assembly, I doubt he would have had time to write his early stories. And had he been in the California Assembly, which is, the California equivalent of the House of Representatives, the lower seat, the lower house, had he been a representative of the assembly, I doubt very seriously that he would have gone back to Philadelphia during the war, because state legislators were very much exempt from military service. Heinlein had been compulsory retired from the military as a lunger. Tuberculosis in those days, tuberculosis was considered incurable, and they didn't allow Navy officers, even if it was in remission, to stay in the service. And they called him back up during World War II, but as a civilian. He never held Navy office again, he never held Navy rank again after being retired as a lieutenant. And so he would have been there rather than in Philadelphia, so he wouldn't have been meeting with Hubbard and Fletcher Pratt and Sprague de Camp and those people who were all, and Asimov. They all worked there in the Navy Yard during World War II, and he would never have met Jenny Heinlein, whom he met there as she was a commissioned officer. In fact, I think she was a lieutenant commander when she retired, and he met her there and married her, in 48 or 49, a couple of years after the war. So he would not have met her either. So it changed his life a lot that he did not win that assembly seat.
Speaking of Heinlein, you've met a lot and worked with a lot of authors over the years. I'm wondering, are there any other well-known names that you maybe have a little anecdote of that you could you'd be willing to share?
Well, I don't think of them offhand. Maybe something will come up to me. I have known a lot of them. Paul Anderson was very nearly my best friend, except for Niven. And of course, I've known Larry 40 years, and I know a lot of things about Larry. I am discovering a lot about Larry in my own life now.
Oh.
Having got 50,000 rad of hard x-rays to cure this cancer in my brain, which, by the way, it did. I seem to be cancer-free. But
good.
Recovery from that much radiation sickness kept me on autopilot during much of the last year. And I have found that my memory is not fully recovered, in that a lot of short-term memory consists of my logbook. If I don't write it down, I may not remember it happened. And remembering people's names. People I've known for years, and I can't remember their names when I see them. Well, that's the way Larry Niven has been for the last 40 years. He never recognized one of my 4 sons for maybe 10 or 12 years. They have to introduce themselves when they'd see him at conventions. He knew bloody well that he knew them, but he didn't remember who the heck they were. Larry has the worst, what he calls a data recall or data recovery system in the world, and he's got along that way for 40 years, and I am discovering what it's like to live that way now. You know, they look at you funny because you're talking to them, and it's clear that they think you know them, and you have no idea who they are.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of that problem myself. I'm not very good at remembering names. I'm good at remembering faces and personalities, just not the names.
Yeah, and Larry's is hit and miss. People he knows well. He obviously he has a pretty good understanding of a great deal of human nature. He wouldn't be the novelist that he is, but he doesn't have much in the way of a good short-term memory or a memory for names and faces, and now I don't either. So.
Let me ask you about Isaac Asimov. He's one of my, I guess you'd say, childhood heroes.
Yes.
Did you meet him many times? Or have you talked to him?
I knew Isaac quite well. He was more a friend of Sprague de Camp and people of that generation than of mine. That is, I was a generation later than him, which still puts me older than most. But I used to have breakfast with Isaac at conventions sometimes, and that usually meant I was having breakfast with his wife while Isaac went table hopping or talked to anybody who came around to the table. So Janet's a psychiatrist. Janet and I and my wife would have fairly pleasant breakfast conversation, and every now and then Isaac would join us. I didn't know him well. He had a wonderful tenor voice. We were on several major television shows promoting our books together. I remember the Susskind show, for instance, in which Isaac managed to trump my ace by singing in this beautiful tenor voice and leave me anything to do, because I sure can't do that.
I didn't even know he could sing.
He had a very good tenor voice, and he could sing bawdy ditties, and often did. Very bawdy ditties, but only in private, and never when Janet was around, interestingly.
Oh, okay. He had a reputation of being a bit of a flirt.
And well, he might.
Yeah.
I won't go further than that.
Okay.
I have no evidence that any of his antics on the subject went beyond flirtation.
Mm-hmm. That's the impression I have too.
Just like everybody else, but I have no evidence that it was anything other than fairly aggressive flirtation, most of which was, I think, encouraged by the young ladies who pretended to be horrified.
Speaking,
he was very charming man. You understand, Isaac could be very charming and often was, and he only got testy about a few things. He thoroughly disliked being called Ike.
Oh, really?
Which got me off on bad foot with him, because I was introduced to him as Ike Asimov by the wife of a fairly good friend of mine, and I thought that was his name until I made the mistake of calling him that, and I was told quite unmistakably that he did not care for that name and never would.
Mm-hmm. I had no idea. It never would have occurred to me to call him Ike. I guess I would have felt presumptuous, maybe.
Yeah, I would have thought so too, but had I not been introduced to him, I would have called him Dr. Asimov, but he called me Jerry, so you understand, but once I cottoned on to the fact that he preferred Isaac, that took care of that. Just as Mrs. Heinlein detested being called Virginia.
What did she like to be called?
She was either Jenny or Mrs. Heinlein, but she did not like being Virginia, even though that's her name.
Okay.
Some people are testy about names. Robert, Mr. Heinlein, somewhere in the 40s stopped being Bob and started being Robert. By the time I met him, that was what his friends called him, and he told me that. He said his friends call him Robert. Anybody who calls him Bob, he understands this is not somebody he knows very well.
Okay. Google has stated their goal is to make all information available to everyone. And while speaking at LibertyCon in 2004, you explained to a packed room why universal access to information can be dangerous, and you used the example of how you and your brother made nitroglycerin when you were teenagers. If you would, tell the listeners that story.
Well, first place, I have no brother. This was a friend of mine from down the street. We were living out in Capelville, Tennessee, which now is a suburb of Memphis, but in those days was 20 miles out in the sticks. And during World War II, it was very easy to get things like glycerin and nitric acid and some of the other ingredients. And the process for doing it was told in great detail in a publication that is still easily available. And given today's climate, I guess I won't say how you do it, but it's a very dangerous thing to do. It turns out that we probably were within a few degrees of blowing ourselves to kingdom come. But my point was that if 14-year-old kids, admittedly, I'd have to say I'm probably a little brighter than the average 14-year-old kid, but if 14-year-old kids can take the recipes out of a book and make high explosives, and we did, then the likelihood is going to be that somebody else will think of it too, that others will. The result in our case was humorous. We made like half a cup of this evil smelling, very thick liquid. And I did everything right, and I had made it under just the right conditions. And if you don't have just the right conditions, you're going to blow you and everything else up, which is again why I tell people don't go searching for the way to do it, because you might not find. There are a couple of steps in there that won't be in every publication on this subject. We'd made about a half a cup of it and poured it into a whiskey bottle and put the cap on and floated it out in the hog pond and detonated it. I won't go too much of that into here because it is still one of my favorite after dinner stories, and I tell it at conventions, and I just assume not everybody has heard it, because then I'd have to think of something else to say after dinner.
Okay. Well, I won't press you on it then.
However, there is a piece to this that is worth pointing out. While universal access to all information has its dangers, it also has its benefits. In 1982, I said that by the year 2000, everyone in Western civilization would be able to get the answer to any question that has an agreed upon answer, which is an awkward way of putting it, but that what I meant was that, questions like who is God or something, you can get what everybody thinks of, but you're not going to necessarily get the answer, because how would you recognize if you did? But every question that has an agreed upon answer would be available to every member of Western civilization by the year 2000. I said back in 1982. It turned out, of course, to be wrong by only a few years. That is, it happened earlier than that, because the internet was a going concern by 97 or thereabouts. It also turned out, I later said after the Falkland War, that the Soviet Union had an intolerable dilemma, because it was clear from the Falkland Islands War that either you had to release technology throughout your population, which was equivalent to releasing universal exchange of ideas, or you were simply not going to be able to survive in modern war. As I say, the Falkland Islands War made that very clear. Anybody who wants to read that campaign will understand what I'm talking about. The Brits had troops who were able to hump 80-pound packs, but they were also able to operate radars and various scanning systems and night vision stuff and the rest of it. And without a technically educated population, you can't have soldiers that can do that. So the Soviet Union found itself in a dilemma whether to let this technology go or not. And you will understand that even as late as 1989, when I visited the Soviet Union, to use a Xerox machine, you had to have a license.
A license?
While I was there, a man was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp for having an unlicensed Xerox machine.
Wow.
And mimeograph machines were similar. In those days, the Samizdat business, the publication of many science fiction stories, you handed a guy a manuscript, and the price was he typed it in with a carbon copy and gave you back 2 copies.
Mm-hmm.
That was how many things were published in those days. That's as late as 1989. Now, once the free exchange of ideas became common in the Soviet Union with the glasnost part of Gorbachev, it was pretty clear that nomenclatura were not going to be able to maintain control of that country. And once the implications of the Strategic Defense Initiative had become clear, it was also clear that the Soviets couldn't match us. And they could, which is, application of the strategy of technology once again. We could negate their missile force. Then what were they? Romania with ballistic missiles, only they didn't have any missiles anymore. I mean, after all, the Soviet Union in 1990 had something like 20,000 kilometers of paved roads outside cities, and a single track railroad holding together across degrees of longitude, holding the empire together across degrees of longitude. A great deal of the trucks that ought to have been on their highways were instead blown up in Vietnam and on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, having been transported at enormous cost all the way halfway around the world to North Vietnam. They'd be blown up within a matter of hours when they were sent south. So a lot of the stuff that should have gone into their infrastructure went into attempts at conquest. And the cream of the jest was that after they finally did win, or supposedly win, in Vietnam, they thought that meant they knew how to project force across their borders, and tried Afghanistan, which drained even more.
Yeah, that was a big mess.
Afghanistan was draining Russians. It wasn't just proxies who were being killed anymore. In Vietnam, they could use any kind of soldiers they wanted, and they didn't put many of their own soldiers into it in the first place. Mm-hmm. But in Afghanistan, the attempt to use conscripts from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so forth was disastrous. These guys didn't want to fight essentially their Muslim brothers, so they had to send Russians. Well, once they started sending Russians, the casualty list started coming back to Moscow, and it was, when you started seeing sons of the nomenclatura with one leg, it was a pretty disastrous situation. So,
Yeah, I remember a long time ago reading, I guess it was the late 70s, a buddy of mine at work had a copy of, I think it was called Soldier of Fortune magazine. I don't know if you remember that one. It was
I used to be an editor of it.
Did you really? There was an ad in the back. It said that
Byte Magazine, which was a companion to Soldier of Fortune, both published by Lieutenant Colonel Brown, of U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Yes.
I didn't catch the name of the other one. What's the other one? The other magazine?
Survive.
Oh yeah.
I was fairly big in the survivalist movement during the the 70s and up into the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that. Was it, do you think of it as sort of a, well, like you call it a movement? I was wondering if it's sort of like a philosophy and if it still exists or may eventually resurge.
The magazine doesn't exist because the necessity is less. Young people nowadays do not understand that in the late 60s through up until the mid 80s,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people thought there was a very real possibility of nuclear war
Mm-hmm.
between the United States and what was then the Soviet Union, and that the result would be the obliteration of a fair number of our cities,
Mm-hmm.
and throwing a large part of the population essentially into a chaotic situation in which the economy didn't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, it was fairly radioactive.
Yeah, that's the culture I pretty much grew up in.
Yes, well, and me too. And one of the goals of us old Cold Warriors was to make that not happen. But one of the goals of the Survivalist Movement was to live through it if it did. And I had a big quarrel with Mel Tappan, who wrote Survival Guns,
Mm-hmm.
was the firearms expert of the Survivalist Movement. And Mel actually had only one kidney. Most people didn't know that, and he was partially crippled. Mel and Nancy moved up to the Rogue River in Oregon to establish what amounted to a survival. I mean, he being an author, he could live anywhere he wanted to establish a survival community. And Reg Bretner, science fiction writer, friend of mine, was a friend of theirs. I think after Mel died, I think he and Nancy had a romantic affair. In fact, this is well after Mel died. But Mel died because the medical attention in rural Oregon was nothing like as good as what he was getting from UCLA medics. And he literally died of congested kidney failure as a result of moving up there. My argument with him, and I wasn't arguing too strongly because he was going up there to establish this place where I was welcome if it happened, if I could get there. But my argument with him was that the best way to survive a nuclear war is not to have one.
Well, yeah.
Oh, but I could do a great deal more to influence not having one from Los Angeles than I could from Rogue River, Oregon. This is, remember, before the internet.
Mm-hmm.
This is back when 300 baud was pretty good communication rate on send documents, and there was no internet. There was the old ARPANET, and it was 300 to 1200 baud communication, and not many people had that. I did, as I had friends at UCLA and MIT, but those were the days when it was kind of funny. I would type something on my old computer. This would have been about 1980 by now. I'd type something on my computer. It would go from here by telephone wire to the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica. At RAND, it would go through what was called an IMP into what was then the ARPANET, the internet. From there to MIT. At MIT, there were 2 or 3 servers. One was Top 20 and one was MC. I think I was on MC. Would go there. This would then go across to Top 20, back across the net to the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, and by telephone out to Larry Niven's house in Tarzana. So we're typing back and forth messages at 300 baud by way of MIT. That was the internet in those days. So it wasn't really possible for me to move up to the Rogue River. Mm-hmm. And still, I mean, I could write books, but I couldn't have been part of the political community or had any influence on such things. And I like to think that I made the right choice, that I may have had some influence on not having nuclear war, which was the goal of all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty well known that you you've advised certainly presidential administrations, and there's indications, I'm about to ask you a question about it, that you may have advised presidents too. It's been said several times that you wrote the Strategic Defense Initiative portion of Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address.
That's not strictly true. It has truth in it.
Okay. Some claim you did this to get more funding for space research, and since
That's what Spinrad likes to say. It isn't true.
Oh, okay. Well, since I'm pro-space, I would actually applaud that, whether it's true or not. But my question is, if you could maybe describe what led up to that, and also, do you think that this led somehow to the smaller scale missiles we use now to shoot incoming missiles out of the sky, like the Patriot missile?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Okay, in 1980, November, Mr. Reagan won the election. It happened that shortly thereafter, maybe before, but in that fall, Harry Stein and I were out at JPL for some planetary encounter or another.
That was Dr. Jerry Pournelle. You can learn more at jerrypournelle.com. That's spelled JerryPournelle.com. That's it for this episode of The Future and You. This program is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivative Works 2.5 license. A copy of this license may be viewed at creativecommons.org. Briefly, this means you may, indeed you are encouraged to, copy this entire program as many times as you wish and give it away to as many people as you wish. But you may not copy only a portion of this program, you may not charge anyone any amount of money for it, and you may not use any portion of it to make something new. On the other hand, anyone whose obvious goal is to recommend the show to others automatically gets special dispensation. Offline reviews, which include the show's website, may include brief quotes. And online reviews, such as for a blog or community group or web page, which provide a conspicuous link to the show's website, may use as many quotes as they wish, up to and including a transcript of 1/2 of any interview. The show's theme music is a blues number called Some Sympathy by Chris Jurgensen and is from his album Big Bad Sun, which is available at magnatune.com. Magnatune is an independent record label that sells its catalog of music through online downloads and print-on-demand CDs. The company allows artists to retain full rights to their music and splits equally with an artist all the revenue from the sale of their work. All the music at Magnatune may be previewed free of charge, and customers can even choose how much they want to pay for the music, with pricing ranging from $5 to $18 per album. You can learn more about them at magnatune.com. That's spelled magnatune.com. If you have a theory or opinion about what the future will contain, be it the near future or the far future, you may email it to me at thefutureandyou.com. That's thefutureandyou.com. You may also suggest topics that you would like to hear discussed, or send contact information for experts that you feel might provide valuable insights into the future. Mind you, an expert is not necessarily someone with an impressive degree. The best experts are the people who live or work or strive in the area under discussion. If the subject is science or medicine or academia, a degree is important, but if the discussion concerns trends in construction or firefighting or video gaming, a degree is pretty much meaningless. To get the inside dope, you've got to find the people who actually do this stuff every day. They are the first to see the trends because the trends have already begun changing their lives. As to the topics we will explore in the next episode of The Future and You, I can make no guarantees. Interviews are still being sought, recorded, and edited. All I can promise is that we will ruminate on the future. To learn more, check the show's website at thefutureandyou.com. If you enjoyed the program, please mention it to a friend, and be sure to join me again next time. Until then, I have been your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. On behalf of myself and all my guests, I thank you for listening.